They thought he was just a homeless guy, until a general called him sir. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The old man, Arthur, sat on the park bench, the chill of the early November morning seeping through his threadbare coat like an unwelcome guest. His fingers, gnarled by age and a life of hard work, were stiff as he tried to coax warmth from a lukewarm cup of coffee he'd nursed for the past hour. It was a charitable offering from a nearby soup kitchen, a place he frequented more out of necessity than desire. Arthur wasn't one for charity, not really. There was a deep-seated pride in him, a quiet dignity that clung to him like the scent of pine needles from the park trees, even as his outward appearance spoke of neglect and hardship. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story of sun and wind, of laughter and sorrow, though few ever bothered to read it. His eyes, though, were still sharp, a clear, piercing blue that observed the world with a kind of weary acuity. They missed little, from the hurried scurry of a squirrel burying its winter hoard to the subtle shifts in expression on the faces of the people who passed him by, most pretending he wasn't there, a piece of unfortunate scenery best ignored. Today, however, he was not to be entirely ignored. A sleek black car, the kind that whispered of money and importance, pulled up to the curb opposite his bench. A man in an expensive suit emerged, his face set in lines of impatient annoyance. He was talking loudly into his phone, something about quarterly reports and incompetent subordinates. As he paced, gesticulating wildly, he failed to notice a small, brightly colored child's ball that had rolled into his path. Arthur, seeing the impending collision, called out, his voice raspy from disuse. "Careful there, mister!" The man, startled, looked up, tripped over the ball, and stumbled, his phone clattering to the pavement. His face, already flushed, turned a dangerous shade of purple. He rounded on Arthur, his eyes blazing. Did you do that? You think it's funny, old man, tripping people up? What are you, some kind of degenerate?" Arthur, taken aback by the sudden venom, simply shook his head. "No, sir. The ball. I just tried to warn you." The man wasn't listening. He picked up his phone, thankfully undamaged, and stalked over to the bench. "People like you," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt, "are a blight on this city. Lounging around, contributing nothing, probably waiting for a handout. Why don't you get a job? Or, better yet, just disappear?" He kicked at a small, tattered bag that lay at Arthur's feet, sending its meager contents, a half-eaten apple, a worn paperback book, spilling onto the damp grass. Arthur said nothing. He simply looked at the man, his blue eyes holding not anger, but a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. The man, perhaps unnerved by the old man's steady gaze, or simply having vented his spleen, scoffed and turned away, muttering about vagrants and the decline of public spaces. Arthur watched him get back into his expensive car and speed off. Slowly, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he bent down and began to gather his scattered belongings. He picked up the apple, brushing off the dirt, and tucked the well-loved book back into the bag. It was just another day, another casual cruelty in a life that had seen too many. But this encounter, seemingly insignificant, was a tiny pebble dropped into a still pond, its ripples destined to spread in ways neither man could possibly imagine. Who was this old man, dismissed so easily as a blight? And what was the story etched into the lines on his face? A story the world had long since stopped trying to read. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Arthur's days followed a pattern dictated by the weather and the availability of small kindnesses. Mornings often began before dawn, seeking shelter from the biting wind in the recessed doorway of a closed shop, or, if he was lucky and the night watchman was in a good mood, the relative warmth of the bus station's waiting room. He never begged, not directly, but he wouldn't refuse an offered sandwich or a spare dollar, accepting them with a quiet nod of thanks that was often misinterpreted as indifference by those who equated gratitude with effusive displays. His current home, if it could be called that, was the park bench near the war memorial. It was relatively secluded, shaded by an old oak tree, and offered a vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings of the town without being too conspicuous. He knew the routines of the early morning dog walkers, The joggers who pounded the pathways with grim determination, the mothers pushing strollers on their way to the playground. He was a silent fixture in their daily lives, a part of the urban landscape they navigated without much thought. His most prized possession, apart from the tattered coat that had seen him through countless cold nights, was the worn paperback book. It was a collection of Stoic philosophy, its pages dog-eared and marked with faint pencil notations. He'd found it in a dumpster behind a bookstore years ago, a discarded treasure that had become his constant companion. Its words offered a strange comfort, a framework for enduring the indignities of his existence with a measure of inner peace. Sometimes, when the park was quiet and the sun was warm on his face, he would allow his mind to drift back, not to specific events, but to a feeling, a sense of purpose and belonging he hadn't known in decades. He remembered the crisp lines of a uniform, the weight of responsibility, the camaraderie of men who depended on each other for their very lives. These were fragmented memories, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a past that seemed almost like another man's life. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on them for long. The present, with its immediate demands for survival, was too pressing. Today, after the unpleasant encounter with the businessman, Arthur felt a deeper chill than usual. It wasn't just the man's words, but the casualness of his cruelty, the easy assumption that Arthur was less than human, a problem to be brushed aside. He finished his cold coffee, the dregs bitter on his tongue. He knew he needed to find a way to earn a few dollars. The nights were getting colder, and his thin blanket offered little protection. He thought about trying the recycling center, but his back had been bothering him, and the heavy bins were a struggle. Perhaps he could offer to sweep the sidewalk in front of one of the local shops, though most proprietors were wary of him, seeing him more as a nuisance than a potential helper. He decided to walk towards the town square, where there was usually more activity, more deal_indie. The old man, Arthur, sat on the park bench, the chill of the early November morning seeping through his threadbare coat like an unwelcome guest. His fingers, gnarled by age and a life of hard work, were stiff as he tried to coax warmth from a lukewarm cup of coffee he'd nursed for the past hour. It was a charitable offering from a nearby soup kitchen, a place he frequented more out of necessity than desire. Arthur wasn't one for charity, not really. There was a deep-seated pride in him, a quiet dignity that clung to him like the scent of pine needles from the park trees, even as his outward appearance spoke of neglect and hardship. His face was a road map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of sun and wind, of laughter and sorrow, though few ever bothered to read it. His eyes, though, were still sharp, a clear, piercing blue that observed the world with a kind of weary acuity. They missed little, from the hurried scurry of a squirrel burying its winter hoard to the subtle shifts in expression on the faces of the people who passed him by, most pretending he wasn't there, a piece of unfortunate scenery best ignored. Today, however, he was not to be entirely ignored. A sleek black car, the kind that whispered of money and importance, pulled up to the curb opposite his bench. A man in an expensive suit emerged, his face set in lines of impatient annoyance. He was talking loudly into his phone, something about quarterly reports and incompetent subordinates. As he paced, gesticulating wildly, he failed to notice a small, brightly colored child's ball that had rolled into his path. Arthur, seeing the impending collision, called out, his voice raspy from disuse. "Careful there, mister!" The man, startled, looked up, tripped over the ball, and stumbled, his phone clattering to the pavement. His face, already flushed, turned a dangerous shade of purple. He rounded on Arthur, his eyes blazing. Did you do that? You think it's funny, old man, tripping people up? Were you some kind of degenerate?" Arthur, taken aback by the sudden venom, simply shook his head. "No, sir. The ball. I just tried to warn you." The man wasn't listening. He picked up his phone, thankfully undamaged, and stalked over to the bench. "People like you," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt, "are a blight on this city. Lounging around, contributing nothing, probably waiting for a handout. Why don't you get a job? Or better yet, just disappear?" He kicked at a small, tattered bag that lay at Arthur's feet, sending its meager contents, a half-eaten apple, a worn paperback book spilling onto the damp grass. Arthur said nothing. He simply looked at the man, his blue eyes holding not anger, but a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. The man, perhaps unnerved by the old man's steady gaze, or simply having vented a spleen, scoffed and turned away, muttering about vagrants and the decline of public spaces. Arthur watched him get back into his expensive car and speed off. Slowly, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he bent down and began to gather his scattered belongings. He picked up the apple, brushing off the dirt, and tucked the well-loved book back into the bag. It was just another day, another casual cruelty in a life that had seen too many. But this encounter, seemingly insignificant, was a tiny pebble dropped into a still pond, its ripples destined to spread in ways neither man could possibly imagine. Who was this old man, dismissed so easily as a blight? And what was the story etched into the lines on his face? A story the world had long since stopped trying to read. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Arthur's days followed a pattern dictated by the weather and the availability of small kindnesses. Mornings often began before dawn, seeking shelter from the biting wind in the recessed doorway of a closed shop, or, if he was lucky and the night watchman was in a good mood, the relative warmth of the bus station's waiting room. He never begged, not directly, but he wouldn't refuse an offered sandwich or a spare dollar, accepting them with a quiet nod of thanks that was often misinterpreted as indifference by those who equated gratitude with effusive displays. His current home, if it could be called that, was the park bench near the war memorial. It was relatively secluded, shaded by an old oak tree, and offered a vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings of the town without being too conspicuous. He knew the routines of the early morning dog walkers, the joggers who pounded the pathways with grim determination, the mothers pushing strollers on their way to the playground. He was a silent fixture in their daily lives, a part of the urban landscape they navigated without much thought. His most prized possession, apart from the tattered coat that had seen him through countless cold nights, was the worn paperback book. It was a collection of Stoic philosophy, its pages dog-eared and marked with faint pencil notations. He'd found it in a dumpster behind a bookstore years ago, a discarded treasure that had become his constant companion. Its words offered a strange comfort, a framework for enduring the indignities of his existence with a measure of inner peace. Sometimes, when the park was quiet and the sun was warm on his face, he would allow his mind to drift back, not to specific events, but to a feeling, a sense of purpose and belonging he hadn't known in decades. He remembered the crisp lines of a uniform, the weight of responsibility, the camaraderie of men who depended on each other for their very lives. These were fragmented memories, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a past that seemed almost like another man's life. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on them for long. The present, with its immediate demands for survival, was too pressing. Today, after the unpleasant encounter with the businessman, Arthur felt a deeper chill than usual. It wasn't just the man's words, but the casualness of his cruelty, the easy assumption that Arthur was less than human, a problem to be brushed aside. He finished his cold coffee, the dregs bitter on his tongue. He knew he needed to find a way to earn a few dollars. The nights were getting colder, and his thin blanket offered little protection. He thought about trying the recycling center, but his back had been bothering him, and the heavy bins were a struggle. Perhaps he could offer to sweep the sidewalk in front of one of the local shops, though most proprietors were wary of him, seeing him more as a nuisance than a potential helper. He decided to walk towards the town square, where there was usually more activity, more potential for a small, overlooked job. As he made his way slowly down Main Street, he passed by the Gilded Spoon, an upscale cafe known for its expensive pastries and artisanal coffees. Its owner, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, no relation to Arthur, though the shared surname sometimes brought a wry, internal smile to Arthur's lips, was outside, ostentatiously polishing the already gleaming brass plaque beside the entrance. Henderson was a man who prided himself on the exclusivity of his establishment and had a notoriously low tolerance for anything or anyone he deemed undesirable. He spotted Arthur approaching, and his face tightened into a familiar scowl. Arthur had learned to give the Gilded Spoon a wide berth, but today the sidewalk was crowded, and he had no choice but to pass relatively close. "Don't even think about it, vagrant," Henderson called out, his voice loud enough for several passers-by to hear. "This is a high-class establishment. We don't need your kind loitering around, scaring off the customers." Arthur kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead, offering no response. This only seemed to embolden Henderson. "You hear me, old man? Go find a shelter or something. This town has had enough of you bums cluttering up the place." A young woman, exiting the cafe with a fragrant coffee in hand, looked embarrassed by her proprietor's outburst, but hurried past Arthur without a word. Arthur felt the familiar sting of shame, not for himself, but for the casual cruelty that seemed so prevalent. He remembered a time when respect for one's elders, for any human being, was a given. That time felt very far away now. He carried a small, folded piece of canvas in his pocket, something he'd found long ago. It was discolored and frayed at the edges, but if one looked closely, faint traces of an embroidered insignia could still be discerned. An eagle, wings spread, clutching a cluster of arrows. It was a fragment of something larger, something meaningful, a tangible link to that other life, the one where he had been someone else, someone respected, someone who mattered. He sometimes took it out when he was alone, tracing the faded threads with a calloused finger. The memories it evoked both a comfort and a pain. What truly defines a person? Is it their current circumstances, their outward appearance? Or is it the sum of their experiences, the character forged in the fires of a life lived, even if that life is now hidden from view? If you believe that every individual deserves dignity, regardless of their situation, type dignity in the comments below. And stay with us, as Arthur's path is about to take an unexpected turn. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the Gilded Spoon, seemed to have made it his personal mission to rid the vicinity of Arthur. He saw Arthur's quiet presence near the town square, even on a public bench some distance from his cafe, as a direct threat to his carefully cultivated image of upscale exclusivity. Henderson was a man who measured worth in dollars and cents, in social standing and expensive possessions. An old man in a threadbare coat, clearly down on his luck, simply did not fit into his meticulously curated world. Over the next few days, Henderson's harassment escalated. He would make loud, pointed comments whenever Arthur was within earshot, complaining to his staff or to any customer who would listen about the vagrant problem and how it was bad for business. He even called the local police a couple of times, trying to have Arthur removed for loitering, but the young officers, while perhaps unsympathetic, could find no legal grounds to do so as long as Arthur was on public property and not causing a disturbance. Arthur, for his part, endured these indignities with his characteristic stoicism. He would simply move to a different bench or find a quieter corner of the park, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. He knew that engaging with a man like Henderson was pointless. It would only provide him with the confrontation he seemed to crave. But the constant pressure, the feeling of being unwelcome, of being seen as less than human, began to take its toll. The small kindnesses he occasionally received, a shared newspaper from another park regular, an extra sandwich from the soup kitchen volunteer, seemed to shrink in the face of Henderson's relentless negativity. One particularly blustery afternoon, as Arthur sought shelter from a biting wind behind a large decorative planter in the town square, Henderson spotted him. He marched out of his cafe, his face a mask of fury. "I've had enough of you, old man," he shouted, his voice attracting the attention of several shoppers and business people hurrying past. "This is a respectable town square, not a flop house. You're driving away my customers with your presence." Arthur rose slowly, his joints aching from a cold. "I'm not bothering anyone, Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You are bothering me," Henderson retorted, his jowls quivering with indignation. "You're an eyesore, a disgrace. Why don't you just go somewhere else? Somewhere nobody has to look at you." He took a step closer, his posture menacing. "I'm warning you. If I see you around here again, I'll make sure you regret it." He didn't elaborate on the threat, but his tone was unmistakable. Arthur looked at him, not with fear, but with a deep, weary sadness. He had seen bullies like Henderson before, in many different guises, throughout his long life. Men who derived a sense of power from demeaning others. Men whose own insecurities were masked by aggression. He turned without a word and began to walk away, Henderson's angry shouts following him like a bitter wind. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay there, couldn't endure another public humiliation. He found himself walking towards the outskirts of town, towards the old, disused railway line that ran parallel to the river. It was a desolate spot, littered with weeds and discarded debris, but it was quiet and no one ever came here. He found a relatively sheltered spot beneath a crumbling stone archway, part of an old bridge abutment. Here, at least, he could be alone, free from the scornful eyes and harsh words. He pulled out his tattered book of Stoic philosophy, its familiar weight a small comfort in his hands. He opened it to a dog-eared page, the words of Marcus Aurelius seeming to speak directly to his current predicament. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Arthur sighed. It was wise counsel, but hard to follow when the injuries were so constant, so demeaning. He also took out the folded piece of canvas, the one with the faded eagle. He spread it carefully on his knee, tracing the almost invisible threads. He remembered the day he'd been given the complete item from which this fragment came. He'd been a young man then, standing tall and proud, his heart swelling with a sense of duty and belonging. The contrast between that memory and his current reality was a chasm too vast to comprehend. He wondered, not for the first time, how his life had come to this. There had been choices, yes, some good, some perhaps less so. There had been losses, profound and irrevocable. There had been betrayals, both personal and systemic. And then there had been the slow, inexorable slide into invisibility, into the shadows where society preferred to keep its inconvenient truths. He hadn't meant for it to happen. He had always been a self-reliant man, a proud man. But life sometimes had other plans. As dusk began to settle, bringing with it a deeper chill, Arthur pulled his thin blanket around his shoulders. He knew Henderson's threat was not an idle one. The man was clearly capable of further escalation. But where could he go? This small town, for all its faults, was the only home he had known for years. Was he to be driven out even from its margins? The thought filled him with a despair that was even colder than the November air. The old railway arch offered little real protection from the encroaching night. The wind whistled through the crumbling stonework, carrying with it the damp, earthy smell of the nearby river and the distant, mournful sound of a train horn. Arthur huddled deeper into his coat, the thin blanket providing scant comfort. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, punctuated by dreams of past glories and present anxieties. He dreamt of marching in perfect formation, the sun glinting off polished brass, the roar of engines, the shouts of comrades. Then the dream would shift, and he would be back on the park bench, Henderson's sneering face looming over him, his words like a physical blow. He awoke before dawn, stiff and cold, the familiar ache in his bones more pronounced than usual. He knew he couldn't stay here. This desolate spot, while offering temporary solitude, was no place to live. He needed to find a way back to some semblance of his routine, however precarious. He decided to try the soup kitchen again, even though it meant walking back through the town, risking another encounter with Henderson or those who shared his views. Hunger, a constant companion, was a powerful motivator. As he made his way along the riverbank, the first pale light of morning painting the sky in hues of gray and rose, he noticed something unusual. A small, makeshift encampment had sprung up overnight, further down the river, closer to the old freight yards. A few tattered tents, a smoldering campfire, the silhouettes of figures moving about. Arthur approached cautiously. He usually avoided such encampments. His solitude was a deliberate choice, a way of maintaining his dignity, of avoiding the often chaotic and sometimes dangerous dynamics of group homelessness. But today something drew him closer. Perhaps it was a sense of shared marginalization after Henderson's latest onslaught. As he neared, One of the figures detached itself from the group and walked towards him. It was a younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, his face weathered, but his eyes surprisingly clear and intelligent. He wore a faded army surplus jacket, several sizes too big. "Morning, Pop," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You new around here?" Arthur nodded. "Just passing through this way." "Name's Jake," the younger man offered, extending a calloused hand. "Arthur," he replied, accepting the handshake. Jake gestured towards the campfire. "Got some coffee brewing, if you're interested." "Not Gilded Spoon quality," he added with a wry grin, "but it's hot." Arthur hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. The offer of shared warmth, both literal and figurative, was too potent to refuse. He joined a small group around the fire. There were 3 others, an older woman with a kind, tired face, wrapped in a brightly colored shawl, who introduced herself as Maria, a quiet, watchful young man who looked barely out his teens, named Sam, and a burly, bearded man who grunted a greeting but offered no name. They shared the coffee, which was indeed strong and hot, and a piece of stale bread that Maria produced from a battered bag. For the first time in a long while, Arthur felt a flicker of something akin to camaraderie. They were all outcasts, all living on the fringes, but here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, they had found a fragile community. Jake, it turned out, was a veteran, like Arthur, though from a much more recent conflict. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, come home with a head full of ghosts and a body that no longer quite obeyed him. He tried to reintegrate, tried to hold down jobs, but the PTSD, the nightmares, the feeling of being disconnected from the civilian world, had eventually led him here to the riverbank. As Jake spoke, Arthur listened intently. He recognized the patterns, the unspoken pain, the quiet desperation. He didn't share his own story, not yet. He was a man of few words, his past a carefully guarded secret. But he found himself nodding in understanding, offering a quiet word of empathy when Jake's voice faltered. Maria, too, had her story. A lost job, a sudden illness, a string of bad luck that had spiraled into homelessness. Sam, the young man, rarely spoke, his eyes haunted, hinting at a trauma he wasn't ready to share. The bearded man remained an enigma. This chance encounter, this unexpected moment of shared humanity, offered Arthur a brief respite from his own troubles. It reminded him that he was not entirely alone in his struggles, that others, too, carried burdens unseen by the wider world. It also stirred something within him, a long-dormant sense of responsibility, of wanting to protect those more vulnerable than himself. He saw the weariness in Maria's eyes, the fear in Sam's, the pain in Jake's. These were good people, dealt a bad hand by life. They deserved better than scorn and indifference. As the morning wore on, Arthur knew he couldn't linger. He needed to find food to make a plan. But as he prepared to leave, Jake stopped him. "Hey, Arthur," he said, "if you're looking for a place to crash tonight, you're welcome here. We'll look out for each other." The offer was genuine, heartfelt. Arthur, for the first time in a long time, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the campfire. He thanked Jake, promising to consider it. As he walked back towards town, the memory of that small, struggling community by the river stayed with him. It was a stark contrast to the polished indifference of the Gilded Spoon, a reminder that true wealth had little to do with money or possessions. It begged the question, who are the truly impoverished in our society? Those who lack material goods, or those who lack compassion, empathy, and a basic understanding of shared humanity? Arthur's attempt to find some small work in the town square proved fruitless. The encounter with Mr. Henderson had clearly left its mark. Shopkeepers who might have previously offered him a few dollars for sweeping their storefronts now averted their gaze or waved him away dismissively. It seemed Henderson's venom had poisoned the well of even the most meager opportunities. Defeated and with a gnawing hunger, Arthur found himself once again on his familiar bench near the war memorial. He pulled out his tattered book, seeking solace in its ancient wisdom, but the words seemed to blur before his eyes. His mind was too preoccupied with the immediate, pressing realities of his situation. As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed a small flurry of activity near the base of the memorial. A group of people, mostly older men, were setting up a folding table and a small public address system. They wore caps and jackets adorned with the insignia of various veterans organizations, the VFW, the American Legion. Arthur watched them with a detached curiosity. He knew that Veterans Day was approaching, and these groups often held small, informal ceremonies here. He usually kept his distance from such gatherings. His own service felt like a lifetime ago, a chapter of his life he had long since closed, or so he believed. He had no desire to relive old glories or dredge up painful memories. One of the men, a portly individual with a neatly trimmed white mustache and a VFW cap perched jauntily on his head, spotted Arthur. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Excuse me, friend," the man said, his voice surprisingly kind. "We're just setting up for a little pre-Veterans Day remembrance. You're welcome to join us, if you like. We'll have some coffee and donuts afterwards." Arthur was taken aback by the unexpected invitation. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy. "But I wouldn't want to intrude." "Nonsense, son," the man said, though Arthur was clearly his elder. "Any friend of this memorial is a friend of ours. Name's Bill, by the way. Bill Jenkins, local VFW commander." He extended a hand. Arthur hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took it. "Arthur," he replied simply. "Arthur Smith." He used the generic surname he sometimes adopted when he didn't want to reveal too much. Bill Jenkins didn't press. He just smiled warmly. "Well, Arthur Smith, pleasure to meet you. The ceremony starts in about an hour. Feel free to stick around." As Bill walked back to his group, Arthur felt a strange mixture of emotions. The man's kindness was a balm, but the thought of attending even an informal veterans ceremony stirred up a complex brew of pride, pain, and a deep-seated reluctance to engage with that part of his past. He watched as more veterans arrived, some leaning on canes, others in wheelchairs, but all carrying themselves with a certain quiet dignity. They greeted each other with handshakes and backpats, their camaraderie evident. Arthur felt like an outsider, an observer looking in on a world he had once belonged to, but from which he was now irrevocably estranged. He considered leaving, retreating to the anonymity of the riverbank. But something held him there. Perhaps it was Bill Jenkins's genuine warmth, or perhaps it was a deeper, unacknowledged yearning to connect, however briefly, with those who shared a common thread of experience, even if his own was buried so deep it felt almost unreal. As the small ceremony began, with a prayer, a reading of a poem, and a somewhat off-key rendition of taps played on a portable bugle, Arthur found himself listening intently. The words spoken were familiar, sentiments he had heard many times before, but today they seemed to resonate differently. They spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of honor, of a bond forged in shared adversity. He looked at the faces of the veterans, weathered and lined, yet still holding a spark of the young men they had once been. He saw their pride, but also their pain, the unspoken memories that lay behind their eyes. And for the first time in a long, long time, Arthur didn't feel quite so alone. He felt a connection, a shared understanding that transcended words. As the ceremony concluded and the veterans gathered around the table for coffee and donuts, Bill Jenkins beckoned Arthur over. "Come on, Arthur, grab a cup. You look like you could use it." Arthur, feeling a strange mixture of trepidation and gratitude, joined the group. He accepted a steaming styrofoam cup of coffee and a plain donut, the simple fare tasting better than anything he'd eaten in days. He listened as the men swapped stories, their voices laced with a mixture of humor, sorrow, and pride. They spoke of places he knew, of experiences he recognized, of a shared language that only those who had served could truly understand. He remained mostly silent, an observer on the edge of their circle, but he felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he missed so profoundly. Then, one of the men, a younger veteran with a prosthetic leg, turned to him. "You serve, Arthur?" he asked, his gaze direct but not unkind. The question hung in the air. Arthur looked down at his coffee cup, the steam rising in the cool morning air. This was the moment. He could deflect, mumble something non-committal, and retreat back into his anonymity. Or He took a slow breath. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I served." The simple admission felt monumental, like opening a door that had been locked for half a century. What stories lay behind that door? And what would happen if the world finally learned the truth about the quiet old man on the park bench? The answer, like so much in Arthur's life, was about to unfold in a way he could never have predicted. The admission, "Yes, I served," hung in the air for a moment, drawing the attention of the small group of veterans. They looked at Arthur with a new interest, a flicker of shared understanding in their eyes. The younger veteran with the prosthetic leg, whose name Arthur learned was Ramirez, nodded slowly. "Which branch, Arthur? When did you serve?" Arthur hesitated. It had been so long since he'd spoken of these things, so long since he'd allowed himself to identify with that part of his past. The details felt like they belonged to another man, another lifetime. "Army," he said finally, his voice still quiet. "A long time ago. Cordell." A respectful silence fell over the group. Korea, the forgotten war. Many of these men were Vietnam vets or from more recent conflicts in the Gulf or Afghanistan. Korea was a different era, a different kind of sacrifice. Bill Jenkins, the VFW commander, looked at Arthur with a new intensity. "Korea, you say? That was a tough one, Arthur. My own father served there. Didn't talk about it much." Arthur simply nodded, his gaze distant. He wasn't ready to share more, not yet. The act of simply acknowledging his service felt like a monumental step. He finished his coffee and donut, the warmth a welcome sensation. He thanked Bill Jenkins and the others for their hospitality, feeling a renewed sense of human connection that had been absent for too long. As he prepared to leave, Ramirez stopped him. "Hey, Arthur," he said, "there's a more formal Veterans Day ceremony at the town hall tomorrow morning. The mayor will be there, some local dignitaries. They're unveiling a new plaque for the Korean War vets. You should come. It'd be good to see you there." Arthur was taken aback. Another invitation. Another opportunity to step out of the shadows. He mumbled something non-committal, his old reluctance to engage resurfacing. But Ramirez was persistent. "Think about it, man. You earned it." As Arthur walked away from the war memorial, Ramirez's words echoed in his mind. You earned it. Had he? He had done his duty, yes. He had served with honor, he believed. But the years since then, the long slide into obscurity and hardship, had eroded his sense of self-worth, buried his past achievements under layers of neglect and indifference. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet contemplation. The encounters with Jake's group by the river, and now with Bill Jenkins and the VFW men, had stirred something within him, a flicker of the man he used to be. But the thought of attending a public ceremony, of being seen, of potentially having his past brought into the light, filled him with a profound anxiety. What if someone recognized him? What if they asked questions he wasn't prepared to answer? What if his current circumstances, his homelessness, brought shame not just upon himself, but upon the memory of his service? That evening, as he settled into his makeshift shelter under the railway arch, he took out the folded piece of canvas again. This time, he looked at it more closely, his fingers tracing the faded, almost invisible lines of the embroidered eagle. He remembered the day he'd received it, not this tattered fragment, but the full, pristine guidon, representing his unit, his men. He had been a sergeant major then, a man of immense responsibility, a leader respected by those under his command, trusted by his superior officers. He remembered the weight of that guidon in his hands, the symbol of everything he stood for: duty, honor, courage, sacrifice. He thought of the men he had led, the young faces full of hope and fear. He thought of those who had not come home, their names etched forever in his memory. He owed them something, didn't he? He owed it to them, and perhaps to himself, to not let their sacrifices and his own be entirely forgotten, entirely erased by the passage of time and the cruelty of circumstance. As dawn approached, Arthur made a decision. He would go to the town hall. He didn't know what he would do there or how he would be received. He only knew that he had to go. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, against the forces that had tried to render him invisible. It was a quiet assertion of his own worth, his own history. He carefully brushed off his threadbare coat, smoothed down his sparse gray hair with river water, and set off towards the center of town, his old service cane tapping a steady, resolute rhythm on the pavement. The man who had been Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins was, for the first time in a very long time, preparing to report for duty. The stage was being set for an encounter that would not only change Arthur's life, but would also force a small town to confront its own forgotten history and its treatment of those who had given so much. The town hall plaza was abuzz with activity. A small stage had been erected, adorned with flags and bunting. Rows of folding chairs were set out for attendees, and a local high school band was nervously tuning their instruments. The mayor, a portly, self-important man named Thompson, was already there, shaking hands and posing for photographs with local dignitaries. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the Gilded Spoon, was also present, looking smug and prosperous as he chatted with a group of prominent business owners. He was a significant donor to the mayor's political campaigns and considered himself a pillar of the community. Arthur arrived quietly, keeping to the periphery of the crowd. He felt exposed, vulnerable, his threadbare coat and worn appearance a stark contrast to the Sunday-best attire of most of the attendees. He saw Bill Jenkins and some of the other VFW members near the front, and Ramirez, the younger veteran, waved him over. Arthur, hesitant but appreciative, made his way through the crowd and joined them. "Glad you made it, Arthur," Ramirez said, clapping him on the shoulder. Bill Jenkins introduced him to a few other veterans, who greeted him with polite nods. Arthur felt a small measure of comfort in their company, a sense of belonging he hadn't anticipated. As the ceremony began, with speeches from the mayor and other local officials, Arthur found himself listening with a mixture of cynicism and a grudging respect. The platitudes about sacrifice and patriotism were predictable, the self-congratulatory tone of the politicians grating. But when a young high school student, the winner of an essay contest, read a moving piece about the true meaning of service, Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. The girl spoke of courage not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet endurance of hardship, in the unwavering commitment to one's principles even in the face of adversity. Her words seemed to resonate with his own unspoken experiences. Then came the unveiling of the new plaque dedicated to the Korean War veterans. It was a simple bronze tablet, inscribed with the names of the local men who had served in that brutal, often overlooked conflict. As the names were read aloud, Arthur scanned the list. He recognized a few, men he had known, men who had not returned. His own name, Arthur Jenkins, was not there. Of course it wouldn't be. He hadn't enlisted from this town. He had come here much later in life, a stranger seeking anonymity. After the plaque unveiling, the mayor invited any Korean War veterans present to come forward and be recognized. A few elderly men, frail but proud, made their way to the stage, assisted by family members or fellow veterans. They were greeted with warm applause. Bill Jenkins nudged Arthur. "Go on, Arthur. That's you." Arthur shook his head. "No, Bill. It's not for me." He couldn't explain it, the deep-seated reluctance to claim a place among these honored men, not when his current life felt like such a betrayal of the uniform he had once worn. He felt like an imposter, a fraud. As the ceremony was drawing to a close, and the crowd was beginning to disperse, a black sedan with official government plates pulled up near the edge of the plaza. The car was out of place in this small-town gathering, its tinted windows and serious-looking driver hinting at an importance that immediately drew attention. A man in a crisp, dark suit emerged from the passenger side. He was tall, distinguished, with an air of quiet authority that was unmistakable. He scanned the crowd purposefully, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. Mr. Henderson, ever eager to ingratiate himself with anyone he perceived as influential, hurried over. "Good morning, sir," Henderson said, his voice oozing deference. "Welcome to Harmony Creek. I'm Harold Henderson, proprietor of the Gilded Spoon, one of our town's finest establishments. Can I be of any assistance?" The man in the suit barely glanced at Henderson. His eyes continued to scan the crowd, a look of focused intensity on his face. "I'm looking for someone," the man said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of command. An old friend, a comrade. He paused, his gaze sweeping past Arthur, then snapping back, a flicker of recognition, then disbelief, then a dawning, profound respect in his eyes. He began to walk directly towards Arthur, ignoring Henderson's sputtering attempts to engage him further. The crowd parted instinctively as the distinguished stranger approached the shabby old man on the edge of the gathering. Arthur, seeing the man approach, felt his heart begin to pound. He knew that face. He knew those eyes. Decades had passed, lines had deepened, hair had grayed, but there was no mistaking him. General Wallace, his former commanding officer, a man he had served under, a man he had respected above all others, a man he had not seen in nearly 50 years. The general stopped directly in front of Arthur, his eyes, which had commanded divisions, now filled with a complex mixture of emotions, shock, sorrow, and an overwhelming, profound respect. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The crowd watched in stunned silence, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Then, General Wallace drew himself up to his full, imposing height, his posture ramrod straight, and executed a slow, formal military salute. "Sergeant Major Jenkins," the general said, his voice clear and resonant, echoing across the suddenly silent plaza. "It is an honor, sir." The words Sergeant Major Jenkins and Sir, delivered with such profound respect by the imposing General Wallace, hung in the air, instantly electrifying the atmosphere. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Mayor Thompson, who had been preening near the stage, froze mid-sentence. Mr. Henderson, who had been trailing General Wallace like an eager puppy, stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw slack with astonishment. He looked from the distinguished general to the shabby old man he had repeatedly harassed, his mind struggling to reconcile the two. Sergeant Major? This vagrant? Arthur himself stood rooted to the spot, the general's salute, the respectful address, washing over him like a wave. He felt a lifetime of buried emotions, pride, sorrow, a deep, aching sense of loss, and now, an overwhelming, incredulous sense of recognition, threatening to overwhelm him. His hand, almost an anachronistic reflex, twitched as if wanting to return the salute, but decades of civilian life, of anonymity and hardship, held it back. General Wallace held his salute for a long moment, his gaze locked on Arthur's, a silent acknowledgement of a shared past, of sacrifices made, of a bond that time and circumstance had not erased. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. "It's been a long time, Arthur," the general said, his voice softer now, tinged with an unmistakable warmth. "Too long." Arthur finally found his voice, though it was little more than a hoarse whisper. "General Wallace, I can't believe it's you." "Believe it, Sergeant Major," the general said, a faint smile touching his lips. He stepped closer, and in a gesture that stunned the onlookers even further, he clasped Arthur's worn, calloused hand in both of his. "I've been looking for you for years, Arthur. We all have. The old unit we never forgot. The old unit." The words resonated deep within Arthur, stirring memories he had long suppressed. He thought of the men he had served with, the faces, the names, the shared experiences that had forged an unbreakable brotherhood. He had thought himself forgotten, a relic of a bygone era. To hear that he was remembered, that he was sought after, was almost too much to bear. Mr. Henderson, recovering from his initial shock, now saw an opportunity. If this old man was somehow important to this clearly influential general, then perhaps an association could be beneficial. He bustled forward, his face wreathed in a sycophantic smile. "General Wallace, sir, what a remarkable coincidence. To think that Sergeant Major Jenkins here, a resident, is an old comrade of yours. I must say, he's a very quiet man, keeps to himself. We in the business community always try to look out for our less fortunate citizens." He shot Arthur a look that was meant to be conspiratorial, but came across as deeply patronizing. General Wallace turned his gaze upon Henderson, and the warmth in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a look of such cold, unadulterated contempt that Henderson visibly flinched. "Mr. Henderson, is it?" the general said, his voice like ice. "I believe I'm already familiar with your particular brand of looking out for citizens. My aide has been in town for several days, making inquiries, and the reports I've received regarding your treatment of Sergeant Major Jenkins have been illuminating." Henderson's face paled. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but the general cut him off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. "We'll discuss your community spirit later, Mr. Henderson. Right now, I am here to honor a hero." He turned back to Arthur, his expression softening once more. "Sergeant Major, there are some people here who would very much like to pay their respects, and there is an honor, long overdue, that we intend to bestow." As if on cue, several other men in dark suits, who had been standing discreetly near General Wallace's car, now approached. They were older, like Arthur and the general, their faces etched with the lines of experience, but they carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of lifelong soldiers. They were, Arthur realized with a jolt, members of his old command staff, men he had served with, fought alongside, men he had believed he would never see again. One by one, they stepped forward, their eyes shining with emotion, to shake Arthur's hand, to clap him on the shoulder, to greet him with the warmth and respect reserved for a beloved and long-lost leader. "Sergeant Major, good to see you, sir. We never gave up looking, Artie. You old dog, you haven't changed a bit." The greetings, the familiar nicknames, the shared memories that flashed in their eyes, began to break through the layers of Arthur's carefully constructed reserve. Tears welled in his own eyes, tears of gratitude, of reunion, of a profound, almost unbearable joy. The crowd of onlookers, initially stunned into silence, now began to murmur, to whisper, as the reality of what they were witnessing sank in. This quiet, homeless old man, the one they had ignored or dismissed, was a decorated war hero, a sergeant major, revered by a general and his former comrades. The contrast between his apparent circumstances and his hidden history was staggering, a powerful indictment of their own blindness, their own failure to see beyond the surface. Ramirez and Bill Jenkins, the veterans who had shown Arthur kindness, looked on with pride and a touch of awe. They had sensed something special about him, but they could never have imagined this. Mayor Thompson, sensing a significant photo opportunity and a chance to bask in reflected glory, began to edge closer, a politician's smile firmly in place. But General Wallace, with a subtle but firm gesture, kept him at bay. This moment, this reunion, was not for political grandstanding. It was sacred. It was for Arthur. The reunion of Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins with his former comrades was a sight that held the town of Harmony Creek spellbound. The sheer, unadulterated respect these distinguished-looking men showed towards the man many had only known as a shabby figure on a park bench was a powerful lesson in humility for the onlookers. General Wallace, after allowing Arthur a few moments to greet his old friends, gestured towards his aide, who stepped forward carrying a velvet-lined case. The general took the case, his expression solemn. "Arthur," he began, his voice carrying across the now-silent plaza, "there is a matter of an honor that was recommended for you many, many years ago. An honor that, due to the fog of war, bureaucratic oversight, and your own subsequent disappearance, was never formally presented." He opened the case. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, lay a medal. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest award for valor, outranked only by the Medal of Honor. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. Even those unfamiliar with military decorations understood the significance of such an award being presented by a general in this public forum. "Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins," General Wallace declared, his voice ringing with pride and emotion, "for extraordinary heroism in action on July 27, 1953, near Kumwa, Korea. While leading a desperate counterattack to retake a vital hilltop position known as Baldy, and in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, Sergeant Major Jenkins, then a first sergeant, repeatedly exposed himself to danger to rally his men, direct their fire, and personally evacuate wounded soldiers from exposed positions. Though wounded himself, he refused medical attention until the objective was secured and all his injured men were safe. His conspicuous gallantry, his inspirational leadership, and his unwavering devotion to his men were directly responsible for the success of the mission and saved countless American lives. His actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Army and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the armed forces. General Wallace carefully took the medal from its case. "Arthur," he said, his voice softening, "it is my profound honor and distinct privilege, as your former commanding officer and as your friend, to finally present you with this long-overdue Distinguished Service Cross." With great solemnity, General Wallace pinned the medal to the lapel of Arthur's threadbare coat. It gleamed there, a stark, beautiful contrast to the worn fabric, a symbol of incredible courage finally recognized. Arthur stood very still, tears now streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. He looked down at the medal, his hand rising as if to touch it, then falling back to his side. He looked up at General Wallace, his eyes filled with an emotion too profound for words. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, someone in the crowd began to clap. The applause started slowly, tentatively, then swelled into a thunderous ovation, a wave of respect and admiration washing over the old soldier. Veterans in the crowd, Bill Jenkins and Ramirez among them, snapped to attention, saluting their newly honored comrade. Even Mayor Thompson, for once, seemed genuinely moved, his usual political opportunism momentarily forgotten. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the Gilded Spoon, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, horrified shame. The man he had called an eyesore, a disgrace, the man he had threatened and tried to drive out of town, was a national hero. The weight of his own petty cruelty, his blindness, his arrogance, crashed down upon him with full force. He wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but he was rooted to the spot, compelled to witness the honor being paid to the man he had so grievously wronged. General Wallace, after the applause subsided, put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "There's more, Arthur," he said quietly. "The President has been made aware of your story, of your service, and of your current circumstances. He sends his personal respects and has instructed me to ensure that you are taken care of. You will not spend another night on that park bench, Sergeant Major. You will have a home, proper medical care, and the dignity you so richly deserve." He then turned to address the assembled townspeople. "What you have witnessed here today," he said, his voice firm, "is a testament to the enduring courage of one man. But it is also a reminder to all of us. A reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the most unassuming of disguises. A reminder that we have a sacred obligation to care for those who have sacrificed so much for our freedoms. And a reminder that respect and compassion are not commodities to be selectively dispensed, but fundamental human decencies owed to all." His gaze fell pointedly on Mr. Henderson, who visibly wilted. "This town," the general continued, "has in Sergeant Major Jenkins a treasure it did not recognize. I trust that will now change." The implications of his words were clear. The community had failed one of its own, and now they had a chance to make amends. The story of Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins, the homeless hero of Harmony Creek, was just beginning to be written in the public consciousness, but its impact was already profound. The events at the Town Hall Plaza sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The image of the distinguished General Wallace pinning the Distinguished Service Cross onto the tattered coat of the man many had known only as Old Arthur the Vagrant was seared into the collective memory of the town. News of Sergeant Major Jenkins's heroism and the subsequent revelation of his long years of quiet suffering spread like wildfire. The local newspaper, the Harmony Creek Herald, which had initially sent only an intern to cover the Veterans Day ceremony, quickly scrambled its senior reporters, and the story soon made state, and then national, headlines. "Homeless hero, decorated Korean War veteran rediscovered after decades of obscurity." Mr. Henderson, the owner of the Gilded Spoon, found himself at the center of a storm of public disapproval. General Wallace's pointed remarks about his treatment of Arthur, coupled with the now widely circulating stories of Henderson's persistent harassment, led to an immediate and significant backlash. Customers boycotted his cafe. His staff, many of whom had witnessed his cruelty firsthand, grew openly resentful. Online reviews for the Gilded Spoon plummeted, filled with scathing comments about Henderson's character. Within a week, Henderson, facing financial ruin and public disgrace, issued a rambling, insincere public apology, which only seemed to inflame public opinion further. His carefully constructed facade of respectability had crumbled, exposing the petty, mean-spirited man beneath. He eventually sold the Gilded Spoon at a considerable loss and left Harmony Creek, his reputation in tatters. Mayor Thompson, ever the opportunist, quickly tried to position himself as a champion of veterans' causes, announcing the formation of a new committee to address homelessness among former service members, with Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins invited to be its honorary chairman. Arthur, with his characteristic humility, politely declined the chairmanship but agreed to offer his insights. For Arthur, life changed dramatically and rapidly. General Wallace was true to his word. Within days, Arthur was settled into a comfortable, furnished apartment in a quiet part of town, his rent and living expenses covered by a combination of his long-overdue back pay and benefits, and contributions from a grateful veterans organization that General Wallace had contacted. He received comprehensive medical and dental care, addressing years of neglect. His tattered coat was replaced with new, warm clothing, his worn-out shoes with sturdy, comfortable ones. But more important than the material changes was the restoration of his dignity. He was no longer invisible. People in Harmony Creek now greeted him with respect, with warmth, sometimes with an apology in their eyes for their past indifference. Shopkeepers who had once shooed him away now offered him coffee and a friendly chat. Children, who had perhaps once been warned to stay away from the scary old man in the park, now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and awe. Bill Jenkins and Ramirez became his close companions, ensuring he was included in VFW events and local gatherings. They helped him navigate the complexities of the modern world, from setting up a bank account to learning how to use a simple cell phone. Arthur, though initially overwhelmed by the sudden attention, gradually began to re-engage with life. He started volunteering at the local library, helping to sort and shelve books, his love of reading now finding a new purpose. He even agreed to speak to a high school history class about his experiences in Korea, not dwelling on the horrors of combat, but on the importance of service, duty, and the bonds of camaraderie. His quiet words, delivered with simple, unadorned honesty, had a profound impact on the young students. The park bench near the war memorial, once his only refuge, remained a place of quiet contemplation for him. But now, when he sat there, he was often joined by others, by Bill or Ramirez, by townspeople who simply wanted to sit and talk with him, to hear his stories, to bask in the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen so much, endured so much, and yet retained his fundamental decency and compassion. The fragment of the old guidon, the one with the faded eagle, he had framed. It sat on a small table in his new apartment, a reminder not of loss, but of an identity reclaimed, a past honored. He no longer needed to hide it, or himself. Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins had, in a sense, finally come home. His journey had been long and arduous, but in the end, the quiet dignity he had maintained through years of hardship had shone through, a beacon that had, against all odds, guided him back to a place of honor and respect. The town of Harmony Creek had learned a valuable lesson, that heroes are not always found on pedestals or in history books, but sometimes they're sitting quietly on a park bench, waiting only for someone to see them, truly see them, for who they are and what they represent. The transformation of Harmony Creek's perception of Arthur Jenkins, and indeed, its perception of its own responsibilities towards its veterans and marginalized citizens, was profound and lasting. The story of the homeless hero became a local touchstone, a cautionary tale against judging by appearances, and an inspirational example of redemption, both personal and communal. The new plaque for Korean War veterans at the Town Hall Plaza, the one that had not initially borne Arthur's name, was soon amended. A special addendum was commissioned, detailing Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins's extraordinary service and his belated recognition. It became a point of pride for the town, a place where school groups were brought to learn about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of honoring all who have served. The committee Mayor Thompson had hastily formed to address veteran homelessness, despite its opportunistic origins, actually began to do good work, spurred on by public expectation and the quiet, dignified example set by Arthur himself. They established a small transitional housing facility for homeless veterans, named Jenkins House in Arthur's honor, and implemented programs to help them access benefits, health care, and job training. Arthur, though shying away from any official leadership role, became an informal mentor and confidant to many of the veterans who passed through Jenkins House, offering them not just practical advice, but also a sense of hope and shared understanding. His presence was a quiet reassurance that even after falling through the cracks, it was possible to find a path back to dignity and purpose. General Wallace kept in regular contact with Arthur, calling him every few weeks to check in, their bond of old camaraderie easily rekindled. He even visited Harmony Creek again the following year, not with a formal military contingent, but as a private citizen, an old friend coming to see another. They spent a quiet afternoon on Arthur's old park bench, two aging soldiers reminiscing about times past, their conversation punctuated by comfortable silences. The Gilded Spoon, under new ownership, was rebranded as the Patriots Café, its new proprietor a young veteran who made it a point to offer discounts to service members and to prominently display memorabilia honoring local heroes, with a special section dedicated to Sergeant Major Jenkins. The café became a popular gathering spot, its atmosphere transformed from one of snobbish exclusivity to one of warm, inclusive community spirit. Even the tattered paperback book of Stoic philosophy found a new life. Arthur, with the help of Ramirez, typed out his favorite passages and the faint pencil notations he had made over the years. They compiled them into a small, privately printed booklet titled Notes from a Park Bench, which they distributed through the local library and the VFW Post. Its simple wisdom, born of profound experience, resonated with many in the community, offering comfort and perspective to those facing their own struggles. Arthur never lost his humility, nor did he ever fully shake off the ingrained habits of his years of hardship. He remained a man of simple needs, content with his small apartment, his books, his quiet walks in the park. But there was a new lightness in his step, a warmth in his eyes that had not been there before. He was no longer invisible. He was seen, he was respected, he was home. The story of Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins served as a powerful reminder that behind every face, there is a story. Within every individual, there is inherent worth. It taught a small town, and perhaps a wider world, that the measure of a society is not in its grand pronouncements or its gleaming facades, but in how it treats its most vulnerable, its most forgotten. And it proved, once again, that true honor, though it may be buried for a time, can never be truly extinguished. It endures, waiting patiently for the moment when it will be called forth, recognized, and celebrated, often when and where you least expect it. Some heroes wear capes, others wear uniforms. And some, like Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins, simply with the quiet dignity of a life lived with courage and integrity, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, waiting for the world to finally catch up and pay them the respect they have always deserved. If you believe that every person, regardless of their circumstances, holds a story of value and deserves to be treated with dignity, please share this story with others. And remember to subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where we believe in uncovering the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary and giving a voice to those who have too long been silent.